Your world, your challenges, your faith. When faith within engages the world without, there's power. It's living life from the inside out.
With COVID-19, we join those whose lives were interrupted by plague and epidemic and who found ways, or at least looked for them, ways to serve God and others in the face of dangerous disease. We'll be talking about just that in this Family Life Inside Out interview podcast. I'm Martha Manikas Foster, and when I wanted to know how Christians responded to pandemics in the past, I knew I wanted to talk to Dr. Jennifer Woodruff Tait. I wanted her to be a guide through church history. Tait spends her time doing many things, and among them is serving as the managing editor of Christian History magazine. Welcome back to Inside Out, Dr. Tait.
Thanks. It's good to be here.
What would you say when you think about the whole of Christian history and the church's involvement with disease and pandemics and plagues? What would you say is the mark of the church during those pandemics and plagues? What were Christians most often known for?
Well, in many cases, Christians have been known for compassion. This was particularly the case in the early church. One of the things that began to draw pagans to the Christian message was the fact that when there was a plague in the Roman Empire, the Christians would care not only for the Christian sick, but for the pagan sick. Mm-hmm. This was something that, because of the way the Roman Empire and Roman government was set up, the government did not do. And so there was no one to care for these people, and Christians cared for them. So there have been many heroic stories like that. I think of things like Father Damien. Like, you question whether leprosy is a plague, but certainly, he gave his life working with this very contagious illness. Mother Teresa and AIDS, heroic medical workers. Mm-hmm. I do have to say, though, that there's also been sometimes a response of fear. There were stories during the Black Death, for instance, which we think of as being mainly medieval, but which went on in Europe up through the time of the Reformation. Mm-hmm. There were cases where people fled or, refused to serve those who were sick because they were afraid of the contagion. One particular story about John Calvin. Mm-hmm. This was not his finest moment. Mm-hmm. When a friend of his died from visiting someone who was suffering from plague, he said, well, I'm not going to go visit people who are suffering from plague. And then all his friends said, well, we're not going to go visit people who are suffering from plague. And finally, there was only one man, Sebastian Castiello, who was ready to visit people. And then Calvin had a doctrinal argument with him, and he never got to visit them anyway. So there are stories like that, and I think it's okay to note those stories and to be honest about them.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now, if you're just joining us, you're listening to the Inside Out podcast on family life, and I'm talking with Dr. Jennifer Woodruff Tait, managing editor of Christian History magazine. So Jennifer, the history is up and down, but what would you say the best of the lived testimony of Christians who served Christ during plagues calls us to do today? The best of who we have been through history, and what it calls us to today and in the months and years ahead. And based on what you've seen through history, what might that cost us?
Well, one of the things that's interesting to me as we have been working on the special issue on plagues and epidemics that we've recently published was going back and rereading Martin Luther's treatise, Whether One Should Flee from a Deadly Plague.
Right.
It was in the news even. People blogged about it shortly after the COVID-19 pandemic started. And I'm actually going to read you a couple of words of what Luther said, because he has a really good outlook and good advice even 500, 600 years later. Mm-hmm. He talks about how we should not have fear because our hope is in Christ, but we should also not be reckless. And he says, God has created medicines and provided us with intelligence to guard and take good care of the body so that we can live in good health. Use medicine, fumigate house, yard, and street. Shun persons and places wherever your neighbor does not need your presence or has recovered, and act like a man who wants to help put out the burning city. Mm-hmm. Well, that's not so different than what the epidemiologists are recommending right now. Mm-hmm. Luther looked at this, and elsewhere in the treatise, he talks about the need, particularly for clergy and those in governmental power, to be willing to serve the sick and to risk their lives. But he also says we don't need to be stupid. We can follow the best practices of our own day as we try to do these things. And yes, we may end up putting our lives at risk, but we also, can think about how to do this in a manner that will hopefully preserve the most life, ours and other people's.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the cost is that it may cost us our lives, but we don't go running into that danger for the sake of being heroic. Am I hearing you right?
Right. That was certainly his advice, and I think it's very sound advice, and it's advice I saw in other places, that, you may take on a great risk, for Christ in serving the sick, but God gave us brains. There's no reason to be stupid.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
If the best medical advice of our time tells us that by doing certain things we can help preserve ourselves to serve the sick and others longer, then there's no reason not to do that. And I just find Luther's words could have been written yesterday.
Yes, and I had read, because it just was going around the internet, like you said, just a paragraph of that. I really appreciated the fuller article that you had in the magazine to give me more context. And I think I benefited from more of what he had to say. So I really, really appreciated that.
Yeah, the whole thing's well worth reading.
So, from your perspective, what you've seen in the church today so far, do you think the church has lived that call?
I think in many cases it has. I think of my own church, which has gone totally virtual and has figured out how to give pastoral care and worship and a sense of community over Zoom, recognizing that is imperfect, but trying to do it. I have to tell you that preaching over Zoom is nothing like preaching to people in person, but I am still sharing the word with them, and we are still meeting together. Mm-hmm. And so I see churches wrestling with that, how to use technology in ways that will best benefit their congregations, and also in the cases of ministries, such as gift cards for Kroger's or handing out meals or things that can't be done distance. I see people working very hard on how to do those ministries safely and how to care for the people who most need care while not endangering themselves or the people. Mm-hmm. And I just see a lot of people wrestling with that. I do see some churches that don't seem to be wrestling with that. And I have trouble sometimes with that, because I think, one of the things our faith calls us to the most is compassion in the name of Christ, not just any old compassion, but Christ's compassion. And that may mean that we cannot gather together for a time, and that may be a sacrifice and a time of exile for us. And I think the churches that are sort of doing the most good and having the most community are those who are wrestling with those issues. And we're saying this is not perfect, but we're going to, do the best we can to worship and to care for other people, in a new way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, jumping right on that, what would you ask Christians to keep in mind? What from history might inspire us when living for Christ during this pandemic, when it seems especially frightening or especially difficult?
Well, when we first met with we always have a scholar advisor who helps us plan each issue. And when we first met with Gary Ferngren, who helped us plan this issue, what I was amazed as he began to list off all these plagues and epidemics and what Christians had done was how much none of this is new. That every time there has been an epidemic, it has caught people by surprise, no matter how much they planned or thought. Governments and churches have had to backpedal and figure out how to deal with it. The science has developed. People have tried, whether that's first century science or 21st century science, people have tried different things in order to mitigate the plague. People have responded with compassion. Other people have responded with fear. We've been here before. And we had this conversation with him in April, and that was an incredibly comforting thing to hear, that the church had walked this road before. Every other pandemic, from the Black Death to cholera to yellow fever, all the things we talk about in the magazine, they had all ended. And that we weren't sort of singularly picked out to be confused. People have always been confused and upset by plagues and epidemics. The science has always had to run to catch up, and sometimes if you get too steady a diet of social media, you may think, this is the first time everything's gone wrong. No. Gary Ferngren helped remind us that, no, it's always gone wrong. We've always had to figure out how to deal with it, and we've always had to ultimately place our hope in Christ to get through it. We've ultimately had to think about that great hope in passages like Romans 8, where it says that neither death nor life or angels or rulers or anything is going to separate us from the love of God. Well, we can put plague on that list.
Yeah.
Plague will not separate us from the love of God. Epidemic will not separate us from the love of God. It has never separated Christians from the love of God in the past. And that was really, really comforting to hear him say that.
Well, it's comforting for me to hear you repeat it. So, yes, thank you. Thank you very much. It might be the first pandemic in our lifetime or in the lifetime of a couple of generations, but it's not the first ever, right? Thank you. That's very comforting. And thank you, Jennifer, for sharing your knowledge with us and for joining me here today on Inside Out.
Thank you. It's always a joy to be here.
My guest has been Dr. Jennifer Woodruff Tait, managing editor of Christian History Magazine. You'll find a link to the magazine and to the issue on plagues and pandemics at fln.org/insideout. I'm Martha Manikas Foster with Inside Out on Family Life.